So I'm excited to have Elizabeth Long with us this morning. She's an assistant professor here in the Department of Entomology, where she focuses on integrated pest management, muck, vegetables, and grapes. And I've asked her to come in and talk to us about protecting pollinators from pesticides. So Elizabeth, I'll turn the screen over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about work that I've done pretty heavily during my postdoc, and work I'm slowly but surely building up in my new lab here in the department. So just today, wow, so many things to talk about with protecting pollinators from pesticides, and I know it's a hot topic. So as Denise mentioned, if you have questions as I'm going along, please jot those down. I'll do my best to answer them at the end. So today, really, I kind of want to give a overview, but not make it too dense, and really focus on some applied aspects of what I can tell you, maybe as bee enthusiasts, as beekeepers, as naturalists, or just entomologists, or just bee lovers in general. Some things about what we know about pesticide exposure, how pollinators become exposed, what are the risks in different landscapes, what can we do to help, and then just some of the techniques and the science that have gone into helping us get these answers. So here's just a brief outline. First, I'll talk about bees, which I know most of you, I won't need to tell you what the buzz is. I'll just briefly mention some pollinators that are important here in Ohio, and because we're a big specialty crop producing state. And then just talk a little bit about bee biology, mainly focusing on bee lifestyle, because that's a big part of what influences a particular pollinator's risk of pesticide exposure. And then the third bullet there, I'll talk generally speaking about the risks, which pesticides are most harmful, how bees are exposed, and where in the landscape the risks are greatest. And by no means do I have all answers to these questions, but these are just some of the things I hope I'll get across to you in the webinar today. And then finally, we'll end on a happy note, and I'll highlight some things that all of us can do to promote bees, which of course we know is promoting safe and high quality habitat. Okay, so why all the buzz? I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience, but we know that bees are so critical for the landscape. Obviously, in cultivated crops, they're a huge boost to pollination services. But if we think, well, let me get my pointer here. If we consider natural systems, like this, what looks to be a very barren, dry area, there are some really unique flowers and all around the world in different types of systems like this that wouldn't make it if it weren't for pollinators visiting these plants. And these may not be just bees, but other pollinating insects as well. So they're important, not just economically, but also ecologically. And of course, we know the value of insect pollination is incredibly high. This figure is a little dated from a study that was done in 2009. It's probably well higher now, into the probably 20 billion figure. But directly dependent crops alone at that time was estimated that the value of pollinating insects was 15 billion. And if you break that down, it's roughly 11.5 billion due to honeybees, and a little over, close to 3.5 billion due to non-honeybee pollinators. And just some pictures here of, all the delicious things we enjoy thanks to pollinating insects. So here in Ohio, and I bring this up also because I'm relatively new to the area. Okay, I've lived here almost 3 years, but it still seems new. So many amazing, delicious specialty crops grown here in Ohio. We have lots of cucurbits, pumpkins. I believe Ohio is maybe third in the nation or fifth in the nation. It's one of the top 5, I believe, in pumpkin production. Cucumbers, of course, blueberries, peppers, field peppers, and also apples and peaches and things. So lots of delicious fruit that we enjoy that are insect pollinated. And just quickly here, I wanted to highlight some of the key crops. And of course, the cucurbits are all completely dependent on insects for pollination, and that's what this number 4 means. We don't get a fruit without the pollinator if transferring pollen and doing this service. So it's essential for these plants that I have here listed, or these crops that are all delicious. But there's also many other crops that we, value and sell commercially that are really highly benefited by pollinators, even though they're not essential. Pollinators are not essential to get a fruit. And so the list here is a little bit longer, and you can see this number 3 just designating that their contribution to fruit production is great. And I just want to emphasize here that these pollinators may be honeybees, bumblebees, solitary bees, leafcutter bees, but also flies. So some interesting other insects in the group out there that contribute to these pollination services. So now that's kind of the specialty crop overview here in Ohio. That was really brief. But now I want to talk about who the pollinators are in these systems, because protecting pollinators requires that we know who they are. So there are many of them, but for the bees, I'll just focus on honeybees, which most of us are familiar with, bumblebees, which we've all probably seen as well, and several different species of solitary bees. This list is not exhaustive at all, but just some of the common ones: mason bees, leafcutter bees, and squash bees. And butterflies are also considered pollinators. They're not really their service is not quite as reliable as bees. Actually, we don't really use butterflies, obviously, in commercial pollination, but they do transfer pollen. Flies can be some really good pollinators, particularly on days when it's kind of cloudy and some of the bees aren't out. And different beetles too, although that's a slippery slope because beetles kind of tear up the flowers when they're in there to get the pollen. So just a few pictures here of some of these pollinators. Many of you as bee enthusiasts or beekeepers have probably seen, I should actually also say fruit producers, if any of you grow or have a home garden. These pollinators are all going to be familiar to you. The honeybees, the mason bees, squash bees here, I think they're so cute. And they sleep in the flower. Of course, bumblebees, leafcutter bees. I was just telling Denise that there was a leafcutter bee on my patio yesterday, checking out my patio table. And also hoverflies, and these are flies that are important pollinators in many ways, but their larvae are also actually predaceous. They eat pests, so it's an interesting beneficial insect that you can also see is trying to mimic a bee here. So bee biology really influences, or the ecology, I guess, of bees really influences their likelihood of exposure to pesticides. And I just want to go through and highlight some key features that we think about in the research and understanding how likely certain bees are to become exposed. So the key ones I would say are 4 that I have listed at the top of the slide here. First, it's the question of whether the bee is a social species or a solitary bee. And social just means that these 3 traits underneath are true for the bees. So wait, I'm trying to get my pointer here. So social bees have this reproductive division of labor, which means there's a queen who lays the eggs, and related members of the family do most of the work. But there's just one queen who is the reproductive. The second trait is that there's cooperative brood care. So it's a big colony. There's a queen or mom lays a bunch of eggs. And sisters, in this case, do a lot of work to help promote the survival of their siblings. And that's what gives rise to this, big kind of amazing colony that can do so much work and be so successful. And then there's an overlapping of generations, meaning that well, it kind of goes along with this cooperative brood care. Older sisters stick around to take care of younger siblings, and that continues over the life cycle of the colony itself. So, of course, solitary bees don't have these characteristics, of course. They're way smaller colonies, and there's not that group, not this cooperative kind of brood care overlapping of generations. It's just one little bee doing a lot of work to promote the survival of her few offspring. So social versus solitary, I kind of already alluded to the colony size. Obviously, honeybees, bumblebees have larger colonies than solitary bees do. Their foraging habits are also quite different. So honeybees, for example, it's said that they can fly up to 3 miles away to find resources, to collect pollen or nectar. And so they're very flight capable. They're they're able to disperse a long distance across the landscape. But solitary bees, in contrast, are often smaller bees. They just don't have this foraging capability, so they're not as able to fly as far. And even, let's say, if they could, that's just not their behavior. So they tend to stick around within maybe, I don't know, 100 yards of their nest entrance. So they're obvious. The big difference there being if you're moving across the landscape more or farther distances, you may be more likely, right, to be exposed to pesticides than if you stick around in a small area. Of course, that depends on where your habitat is. So this final characteristic that I want to mention is habitat. And so where they actually nest in the environment. So honeybees, we're really familiar with what those nesting sites look like, at least for beekeepers in an apiary. But solitary bees and other wild bees use really different habitats or nesting structures. They may be empty tubes, they may be holes in the ground, they may be little holes in your house, cracks between bricks. So where their habitat is located also influences where they're likely to be exposed to pesticides. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. And just because I'm an entomologist, I love to point out some of the shared qualities here. Many of you probably know this, but with bees, all the workers are female. And for those of you who didn't know, the stinger is actually the same, I should say, the same appendage that the bee would use to lay eggs. So the ovipositor is the technical name for that. It's the egg layer or egg laying organ, and the stinger, they're the one and the same. And all bees, actually most insects, use pheromones to communicate. So that's a big part of how these bees, particularly in the larger colonies like bumblebees and honeybees, are able to communicate so effectively despite having such large numbers in the colony. Oh, I just remembered. I wanted to mention here that I just have a good friend. I like to tell the story every time I give a talk, who argues with me that bumblebees don't sting. And I just, want to clarify that that is not true. Bumblebees can sting. And they can actually sting repeatedly because their stinger is not barbed. Unlike honeybees, well, can't see it here, but the honeybee stinger has a little barb on the end. So if they sting something with skin, or like a mammal or you or I, that barb gets caught and it gets pulled out. And so, of course, they die and they can only sting once. But that's not the case for other bees. So just a little interesting fact there. So this is just coming back to some of the differences. I just wanted to show some pictures here of honeybees and bumblebees, which of course are the social ones. The caste, or those are the individuals that are working in the colony. There's a queen that's large and larger than the worker bees. She lays the eggs. There's many workers. So you can see in a honeybee colony there could be up to 50,000 workers, while in a bumblebee colony there's usually 400 or less. And then of course there's drones. These are the males. They don't do any work, but they usually appear at a certain time of the season, and they disperse, they mate with females, and they die. So just a little bit there about differences in the sizes of these colonies. So you can see there's a lot of differences, not only within or differences between social versus solitary bees, but there's a lot of variation within social bees as well in terms of their structures and the sizes of their colonies. And last but not least, food drives caste formation. And for those of you who keep bees, you know this, but I just find this really fascinating that, in the case of a honeybee, the queen lays an egg, the larva hatches, and its progression into either a queen or a worker bee, that's all influenced by the diet that they're fed. So anyway, it takes longer to make a queen than it does to make a worker bee, and the big difference in these diets is protein. So that's all I'll say about that, but I think that's really interesting and amazing. Just imagine I guess that's kind of the case for us, but maybe not quite so amazingly. Okay, so I just want to talk now a little bit about solitary bees, or let's say non-honeybees, in terms of what their nesting sites look like. And this is a big part of understanding how their exposure risks may differ. So as I mentioned, there's no division of labor with solitary bees. And their nest sites are often in stems, as you see pictured here on the right, um, or in the ground, as you can see here. Their colonies are typically small, so I think roughly speaking, a single female may have or care for maybe, I don't know, 10 to 20 young, maybe less in her lifetime before she dies. So these are small colonies, and they rarely sting. So I like to say these are the cute, fuzzy, sweet bees. Um, and this is here in the top right, I have a picture of the cells that um, these bees have created. There's the pollen here that's been provisioned for the egg that's laid. And then you can see they're just separated by these little mud. This is probably a mason bee between the cells here. So you can see this one's eaten some of its little pollen ball. Anyway, and they're just so cute. I mean, who can say no to this face? It's just adorable. And as a function of doing the work that I have done, I'm really amazed how I, as an entomologist, and as I like to think of myself as a bee lover, have missed these little mounds. And so often I'll see these and I think, oh my goodness, there's an ant mound. Not that ants are bad. But in fact, this little a bee house, or a bee's home. So please just be aware of the different habitat that these bees live in, because you may inadvertently destroy their nest if you don't know what it is. Okay, so I would say beginning in probably 2000, the mid 2000s, there's all these concerns about bees, and this was really driven by declines in honeybees. In fact, in 2013, Time Magazine devoted their cover to this issue. That's how big a deal it was, and I think still is. It's important. Still is in terms of the media. Obviously, it's important. So people are marching, trying to understand what's going on. What can we do? And of course, for beekeepers, this was a big issue because it was estimated that each year from 2007 to 2010, there's roughly a 33% decline in the survival or the number of colonies. So not only was it getting harder to keep the bees, but they were dying for, at the time, unknown reasons. And some of this has been attributed to what's called colony collapse disorder, which is I think a lot of different things going on there. And that's not my expertise, so I'm not going to get into it too much. But certainly there are several suspects in this, what they would call colony collapse disorder. And one are parasites and pathogens. And many of you, especially if you keep bees, are aware of these little tiny discs or little mites on the back of this honeybee. These are varroa mites. If you think about the varroa mite, this little mite is to the bee what ticks are to us as humans. So they attach to the bee and they suck the hemolymph, or an insect's version of blood, out of the body. And in so doing, they can actually transmit these viruses and other pathogens that can make the bees really sick, and not just an individual, but through the whole colony. So parasites and pathogens are one of the big suspects in the decline of bees. Certainly also things like certain management practices. I'm not a beekeeper, so I'm not saying that people are keeping bees incorrectly, but my understanding from the literature is that there's concern about what we're feeding bees, and particularly the use of syrup. I can't think of my brain's slow right now. Anyway, providing kind of less nutritional food to bees, particularly in the wintertime. Habitat simplification, and this is not something new, but obviously this is a big player, right? Because pollinators need to go out and collect different kinds of pollen to be healthy, right? So I love blueberries, and I think a lot of pollinators love blueberry flowers and blueberry pollen, but if that's all they had to eat all the time, they probably wouldn't be that healthy, even though it's not necessarily, the resource itself is not bad for them. So having a really simplified habitat like this, where all crops of the same kind bloom at the same time and then they're done, creates this boom bust kind of cycle. So that can be really challenging for pollinators that are looking for good resources in the environment, particularly to keep their diet nutritious. And last but not least, and the focus of the talk today, are pesticides. And certainly we all know that they're key players, and they've been getting a lot of heat in the media, particularly a certain class of pesticides. So from here on, I'll focus on the pesticides and what we know about those and their impacts on bees. So I know for myself, one of the key questions I would want to have as somebody who doesn't do this for a living would be to understand, which pesticides are really toxic. Which one should I be most worried about if I have bees? So if you look at this chart, from left to right, we're moving from less toxic to more toxic pesticides. So herbicides, things like glyphosate, or the common name for that is Roundup. I almost forgot it. These are generally speaking the least toxic to pollinators. However, I should mention that herbicides they're not directly toxic to pollinators, but they are bad indirectly, because herbicides remove plants, and particularly weeds, and pollinators, especially early in the season, really rely on weeds because that's the only source of pollen and other nutrients for them early in the season. So herbicides are bad because we spray them a lot because we don't like weeds, even though the weeds are good for pollinators. Fungicides, these are things to kill pathogens. We use them in a lot of systems, particularly fruiting systems. Relatively speaking, are intermediately toxic. And then insecticides, of course, are the most toxic for bees. And that makes sense, right? Because bees are insects and insecticides kill insects. So there's quite a bit of research also that's demonstrated, particularly with honeybees and bumblebees, that combinations of these products, fungicides and insecticides combined, which you can buy, right? Because the idea is you can spray once instead of spraying two different products twice. But combinations of these can actually be more toxic than any of these would be alone. So there's quite a bit of research about that, and that's a big concern. I would say from my perspective, this is a really hot area still today, this synergy between fungicides and insecticides. So if we think about insecticides, particularly, how they act or how quickly they do what they do influences their toxicity, right? So we have things that are contact and fast acting, right? Things like wasp spray, because you don't want to get close and you want them to fall down quickly so they don't land on you and sting. So these tend to be very toxic up front, like you would not want to get this on you. It kills the bees very quickly. But this is in contrast to things that are slow acting or maybe function over a longer period of time with a lower dose. So these are products that are typically ingested by the insect, and then over time they accumulate and they have this residual activity. So little by little, the insect gets sicker and sicker until it dies. And you can think of things that are in like ant bait, for example, killing insects this way. So a key class that are really toxic and that have really gotten a lot of attention in the insecticide realm are the neonicotinoids, which you may also hear me refer to as neonics. And I'll talk about those next on the next slide. So yes, I think I mentioned these synergistic or extra potent mixtures between fungicides and insecticides. And adjuvants can also be toxic, particularly to pollinators. And adjuvants are things that we call wetters or stickers. They help the chemical actually stick to the plant better so that it protects it from the pest that's going to chew on the foliage. Okay, so we use a lot of pesticides. I mean, it's kind of alarming, but that's life. And particularly these systemic pesticides, which are products that are moved through water, they are a big concern, and the neonicotinoids are in this group. And there's a big concern about them because they move through water to all these other systems. And so in so doing, we can apply, like in this picture, insecticides to a cornfield, but if there's a lot of rain or something happens and it all gets washed off, that product drifts into these what we call non-target areas, or areas that we never meant to treat with a chemical pesticide. And then we just have this can of worms where all these other environments and organisms living there are exposed. So water is a well-known example, or the role of water in dispersing chemicals unexpectedly. Soil, because topsoil can actually blow off and drift into other areas, and if that's treated with chemicals, there's concerns about that contamination. They can be exposed or excuse me, these chemicals can be released into the air in unexpected ways. And I'll talk more about this because this is actually the system I did a lot of my work in. And then, of course, all of our knowledge of these unintended routes of exposure are directly the result of people realizing that something was going on with their honeybees. They were declining, they were disappearing, they were getting sick, and there was this outcry for why that was happening. Okay, so the neonicotinoids, they are a new class of insecticides. They are synthetic derivatives of nicotine, and which basically means they're potent neurotoxins that act on the central nervous system of insects. They're effective against a broad range of pests, particularly sucking insects and soil pests. And they've been widely adopted worldwide, and this is one of the issues with so much concern about this particular class of insecticides. So they're widely adopted based on certain key features that at the time seemed like a good idea. So they have a low vertebrate toxicity, and that's important, right? Because we are vertebrates and we want to make sure things we use don't hurt us. They're very persistent. So the EPA, for example, has documented the half-life of one of these chemicals, clothianidin, which is common in lawn care products, agricultural products, that it takes between 148 to over 1,000 days for half of this product to break down once it's been in the environment, which is a really long time. So on the one hand, that seems frightening, but if you think from the perspective of being economically useful or feasible, this is ideal, right? Because you don't have to go out and spray every 3 days or every 7 days. You can apply once and have this confidence that that product is going to persist to protect your plant over time. And of course, the third reason is, and I mentioned this before, they're highly water soluble. So they're easy to mix and they're easy then to apply, right? You could spray it on a plant, you could inject it into a tree, you could drench it to the soil. And that water moves through the entire plant and protects all parts from particular pests. So this is really attractive, right? Just drench the plant, the whole thing is protected for a certain period of time versus spraying certain parts and making sure you get really good coverage, because that's a challenge. If you're doing agriculture or growing fruit or something at a large scale. So the unfortunate thing about these neonicotinoids that was not known in the beginning is that they are highly, highly toxic to pollinators, particularly honeybees. And so I just have here that this contact LD50, and this refers to the amount of the product, that it takes to kill, or the lethal dose, that's what LD stands for. The lethal dose required to kill 50% of a population is 2.2 times 10 to the minus 8 grams. So yeah, take that decimal point and move it 8 places to the left. And that's how little it takes to kill a single honeybee. So they're highly, highly toxic to bees because it takes so little, right, to kill them. And that is what we refer to as acute toxicity. So I forgot to mention that these neonicotinoids, the way they kill the insect, they act on the central nervous system, but what happens is that the chemical binds to certain receptors in, let's say, the honeybee's body, and it causes it to tremor and shiver and get excited uncontrollably. So it would basically be like you or I having way too much coffee, which maybe I've already had, and they basically can't stop that. They can't break down the product, so they basically tremor and shake uncontrollably until they die, until their energy is exhausted. And that's how these products work. Okay, so I think some of the information about the neonicotinoids got really hot, back in late, 2010 or so. And I just want to tell you a little story here of how this came about. So growers around the world, particularly people sowing seed in the field, mainly corn seeds, they realized that right around the time the corn would be sown, that all these dead bees would be showing up in neighboring areas, particularly if folks had bees or beekeepers had bees. And as they put two and two together, they realized that, bees are dying whenever corn is being planted, but we also noticed that the bees are dying after certain kinds of seed treatments, or corn with certain seed treatments have been planted. And these purple, teal, and pink seeds here, this is not nerd candy. These are the neonicotinoid seed coatings that are put on the surface of the seed to protect it. So again, the idea is you plant the seed into the soil. When they get wet or it rains, that coating is liquefied and it's easily taken up by this young germinating plant that is vulnerable to pests that may be in the area. So these seeds have a coating on them. They're planted or placed into the planter, and unfortunately they realize that as they're being sown, the machine itself kind of rattles those seeds around and some of that coating gets abraded and broken off. And that ends up in the vacuum system of the tractor or the planter. So as they're planting and that exhaust is coming out, all the dust that you see here has, small amounts of these neonicotinoid insecticides in it off the surface of these seeds. And so what they found, or what was observed across the world, in Indiana, in Ohio, in Italy, in Germany, and France, was that after this happened, all these bees would turn up dead. This is a picture that we took in Indiana. So I kind of didn't tell that story in the order I was planning, but the idea is that the bees fly along these fields, and of course there's no crop in the field, right, that's attractive at the time. But if any of you are familiar with cornfields or soybean fields when they're not in production, early in the season they have a grassy margin and there may be quite a few weeds there. So the suspicion is that the bees are flying across these fields at the time of planting to get to these weedy margins to get pollen, and in so doing they fly through this toxic dust cloud and they die, which is pretty sad and also strangely incredible. I mean, no one ever thought that this would be a way bees would be exposed to insecticides. In fact, the whole idea of putting these seed treatments on was to put the product directly into the ground so that it wouldn't move and get anywhere in the environment where we didn't want it to go. So when I was a postdoc, I actually went out to fields when they were planting this neonicotinoid treated corn, and I basically chased the dust. So I put up these monitoring stations and collected the dust so that we could quantify how much insecticide was actually in the dust and how far, up to 100 meters away from a field, we put these stations. And these fields ranged in size from 10 acres to more than 100 acres. So we could get an idea of how the size of the field influenced the drift of these neonicotinoids. And what we found was really shocking and kind of disturbing. So this neonicotinoid dust is drifting way, it's getting to areas we never thought it would get to in the landscape. So here I'm showing you the state of Indiana. The yellow is showing the range or the extent of the dust falling on outside treated fields. So just a few things here. The black dots represent apiaries that we know exist in the state. So we used the location of these apiaries and then took the information from all these fields that we sampled, the different distances away from the field that we collected the dust, what the concentration of the pesticide was in that dust, and then we modeled what that would look like if we were to assume this drift happened outside every corn or soybean field in the state. And so what I'm showing you here on the left, the black dots again are the apiaries, but this left figure refers to or shows what that drift would look like, the contamination landscape would look like if there was no drift at all, which we know is not true. On the right, this is the well, not worst case scenario, but this is assuming that drift occurs 90 meters away from a field. And in fact, we found dust 100 meters away. So this is being conservative. So the upshot of all this is that the landscape is looking really risky and dangerous for pollinators, particularly those pollinators that are highly sensitive to these neonicotinoids, like the honeybees. So we were excited to get this work out and publish it to make people aware, but it's also really kind of depressing, right? It's like, sheesh, these poor bees, you know, where in the landscape can they go that it's going to be safe? And I don't have the answer to that, but just to, you know, give you an idea, this is what we're up against and what the bees have to deal with. So I've talked a little bit about how, one example anyway, of how the neonicotinoids end up in the environment. I just want to talk a little bit about the different effects that they have on the bees. And this is important because this helps us understand how, when we can expect to see, you know, decline in the colony. What's the time frame that these things happen? So as I mentioned before, there are lethal effects. Like that wasp spray example that I gave, these happen immediately, right? They are acutely poisoned and they die. And there's a lot of concern about these products, of course, but the acute poisoning happens, you know, instantaneously or relatively instantaneously, and then the product is gone. On the other hand, we have sublethal effects, and these are what you can think of as chronic effects that happen little by little over time. And in the beginning, when the neonicotinoid, I would say, drama kind of showed up in the media, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on these lethal effects. But now I think the shift has focused more to understanding these sublethal effects, because these are the things that can sneak up on you, right? So I just want to break down, there's been a lot of research, and this is not my research expertise, but just want to let you know that there's been extensive research looking at these sublethal effects on honeybees, bumblebees over time. And so what they've shown, and I have it color-coded here, are key negative effects on certain aspects of a bee's biology. So in blue here I have impaired ability to fly and return home, and home may be, you know, wherever, but to the nest, and this impaired learning ability. So these studies have demonstrated that these neonicotinoids actually, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? They basically reduce the ability of these bees to function mechanically. And so, of course, that's a problem, because then they can't do what they need to do. And we know learning is a big part of a bee's success. The next category I have in orange here, these researchers have found that when they're exposed to neonicotinoids, honeybees have increased foraging time, so it takes them longer to go out and forage, longer to return back to the nest. And it also increases their susceptibility to pathogens, particularly viruses. And I believe in bumblebees, it's been demonstrated that it influences their susceptibility to gut pathogens as well. So again, that's kind of comes back to what I mentioned earlier. These neonicotinoids act on the bees by influencing their motor function, right? So they're a little jittery, they're a little maybe drunk, might be another way to think about it. So they just have a little bit of trouble doing what they do as quickly. And you know, increasing foraging time is also important to think about, because when bees are out, they're vulnerable, right, to birds, to other predators. So the more time they spend outside the nest, the more the greater their risk of something happening to them and not coming back. The third color I have is purple. And these are things like reduced lifespan, which is not surprising, right? Because insecticides kill insects. There's reduced egg laying, and also reduced queen production. And these I want to highlight as key negative effects that these neonicotinoids have on the biology or the physiology, right, of the bee. So if you think about any of these individually, they seem bad for sure. But consider that all of these things may be happening little by little over the lifespan of a colony, right? So if a few workers don't come back, no big deal. But let's say if you don't come back, and then some take a little bit longer to come back, some get sick, there's not as many eggs being laid, these things really start to add up. And this, in fact, is one of the things that we think has happened with, well, I shouldn't say we, but I suspect has gone on with colony collapse, and the pattern we've seen in bees, the colonies declining, and then slowly but surely they just don't make it. So I mentioned that there's been a lot of papers, a lot of research, I should say, on this. This is not by any means exhaustive. And some work that I did, and I'll talk about a little bit later, we found that non-cultivated plants actually are a key source of pesticide exposure for honeybees. And I'll show you what some of those pictures look like moving on. But so just to show you that this is still a really active area, people really care, and we're still trying to understand what's going on so we can promote pollinator safety. And I just want to highlight a particular paper that was done by a colleague in Australia. And I think he's really changed how we approach risk assessment to bees, or how we approach thinking about it. Oh, I just realized I switched the order of the slides here. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. So we know what the sublethal and lethal effects are. We know the time frame that they happen, but how are they actually exposed outside of that example I gave you with the dust? Well, obviously there's direct contact with pesticides, right? They could be sprayed, or, you know, they could be contacted by landing on something that's been sprayed. But in the case of the dust, for example, the body hairs trap these particles to the surface of the bee's body. And this is really a big deal if you think about bees, because bees are experts at collecting tiny particles, right? They collect pollen. And there's some interesting work done back in 2000, or a paper published in 2000, that's demonstrated that bees, as they fly through the air, are actually electrostatically charged, right? And this charge helps them collect the pollen. So when they get close to the flower, the pollen's like, whoop, it just kind of is attracted to them because of the change in this, or the difference in the electrical charge. So if you think about that combined with them flying through these fields of contaminated dust, it's not a good outcome. Or I guess I should say it's no surprise that they are so negatively affected by the dust. So they can be directly exposed, but they can also be indirectly disposed, or what we refer to as secondary contact. And so this is basically the uptake of pollen, nectar, water, or plant water, which is called guttation, for food, or for water. They ingest it that way. They may also come into contact, I mentioned this, with contaminated surfaces. So again, landing on a plant that's just been sprayed, or something like that. So these are the main ways that pollinators may be exposed to pesticides. So what is the risk? And this is the slide I thought was next. But so Sanchez Francisco Bayo and his colleagues were really thinking about how we approach risk assessment for bees. We've really focused on historically on LD50. This is the number that most people are familiar with when we think about how toxic something is, the lethal dose required to kill 50% of a population. But if we break this down, it's more than just how toxic it is, right? Particularly from the perspective of a bee. We have things like, we have to consider the frequency of exposure, right? How likely are pollinators to come into contact with pesticide residues? And of course, this may vary, right, depending on whether the pollinator is in an agricultural landscape, or in a wild habitat, or in an urban area. So this frequency here really is getting at the likelihood of exposure. The other question, or the other component of this risk, is residue dose, right, or the amount. How contaminated are the resources that a pollinator comes into contact with? So that's an important part of an equation, right? If you have something that has a little dose, what does that mean versus a large dose? Well, that depends on the frequency, right, of how likely they are to come into contact. And then the last part is what I've mentioned already, the LD50, or the toxicity. How likely is it to kill the bee acutely? So if we think about this risk as consisting of these three key factors, rather than just the acute toxicity, you can see how risk is way more complex than just how toxic something is. So I have here, for example, something can be less toxic, but still be harmful if it's present a lot, right? So let's say we have something that is toxic, but the dose is pretty low. but they are exposed to it a lot, right? Anyway, there's all different combinations of this risk equation we could think about. But I think putting this example or this equation forward, I know it seems kind of simple, but this is not really the way we've thought about risk assessment in the past. So this has been, I think, a game changer for helping us understand what risk will be in the landscape for bees. So rather than go through all a bunch of slides that have words, I just thought I would show you a picture and also emphasize to you or drive home to you just how complex the landscape is in terms of exposure, right? So this is a really nice schematic that was put together that shows the major routes of pesticide exposure for honeybees and their transmission to the hive. So I won't go through this too much, but I just want to emphasize or point out that these dots here, you'll notice they're different colors, and they're just representative, right, of all the different ways that pollinators may come into contact with pesticides, with the idea being that when they come back to the hive, you know, they have a little bit of everything, right, because they've been exposed to many different things, maybe at small levels. And this is what we worry about. This is what adds up. So the dust example that I gave, I mentioned that contaminants blow on topsoil. They run off in water. That water may then be taken up by plants and is presented in the pollen or nectar or in plant water. These are like the little droplets that come off leaves, typically in the morning. They could be deposited on other flowering plants. And then, of course, they may get into the soil. And, you know, that's a big concern for our ground nesting bees. Okay, so the residues in the plants are a key threat as well. And this is something else that has been a big issue with neonicotinoids. We know they're systemic. We apply them to the soil, right, so that the plant can take it up and it's protected throughout. And these plant residues are really bad news for pollinators. Maybe not as they're not as acutely toxic, but again, they're toxic at low levels and it starts to add up. And I just wanted to add some pictures here of other beneficial insects that are key players, right, in our gardens and in agricultural systems because they get rid of pests. But these are also pollen feeders, so things like lady beetles, things like minute pirate bugs, syrphid fly larvae, this is the adult. But they all feed on pollen, and if the pollen is coming from a plant that's been treated, we might imagine that they're getting a dose of pesticides as well. Okay, so I just want to give some examples of the levels that have been found in plants and literature. So this is just particularly neonicotinoids, not any specific one. But if we look at pollen, the range is 1.1 to 134 parts per billion. And I'll just remind you, that previous slide I showed you, 2.2 times 10 to the minus 8 grams, that's 2.2 parts per billion. So if you think of 2.2 parts per billion and where it falls in this range, you can see that the pollen from things like cucurbits, for example, which we know are treated, right, because they're valuable specialty crops, the threshold for damage is very low. So people put products on to protect them. If we sample the pollen from those plants, this is the range we find. So just driving the message home that it's well higher than 2.2 parts per billion. The same goes for plant water or getations, and this is a really nice example of what this looks like. There are actually special glands in the leaves, and they extrude this water when the water pressure or the water potential varies. So anyway, this is just a way that the plant gets rid of extra water. But bees may come to these plants and use this water, right, if it's limiting in the environment. And we know that this happens to some extent, probably not a whole lot, but work has been done both in the field and in the lab. This is on corn, plants that were grown from neonicotinoid treated seeds. And you can see these levels are like outstandingly nightmarish, really, really high. So just showing you that these residues do show up in plant products. And I should mention here that these are scary numbers, but bees aren't really using plant getation water all that much. So just to kind of ease any fears there. So I just want to give a couple of examples then of the cascading effects that pesticides can have on bee health. And so or how they're interconnected, because we often think about, oh, if I have a healthy colony, it can handle pesticide pressure better, or pesticides, may make my weaker colony even sicker. Those types of interactions, which is what I'm showing with these arrows facing both directions here. And so these are some relatively new studies that have shown some interesting things, and I think give us perspective about how we approach pesticide exposure, from the addressing it in terms of being important for bee health, not just because pesticides are bad, right? So there have been a couple of studies, or the study in 2015 showing that honeybee hives that were located in seed-treated corn areas have greater stress gene activity and higher pathogen and varroamite loads. So again, getting at this idea that if they're in areas where they have more pesticides, the activity of their, I guess, what am I trying to say? They're more stressed. Their physiological response to handle this is upregulated. That takes a lot of energy, and so that they have less energy then to handle things like pathogens and parasites. Similarly, higher exposure to insecticides, these are two other neonicotinoids in particular, are associated with reduced winter survival, higher varroamite loads, and symptoms of colony collapse. And so this makes sense as well if we go back to some of the previous slides, where we know that when they're exposed to these neonicotinoids, they're a little, let's say, clumsy or not as sharp in their motor functioning, so they're not as able to get back to the hive with resources. And if you think about how that all starts to add up, you may have hives that don't have the resources they need, for example, so they don't make it as well through the winter. And then they have poor nutrition. They don't have as much time to groom, which is a key way that these varroamites are removed. Anyway, so all these things again add in. These insecticides affect the outcome of the bee health. And then bees with increasing amounts of clothianidin, that's the neonicotinoid I introduced earlier in the talk, they have less glycogen, less fat, less protein. And that kind of goes along with this bullet above, right? Reduced winter survival. Glycogen and fat are key to helping these bees stay healthy, to be able to keep the hive warm, and protein as well. So they just have less nutrition, less insulation. They're just, not as able to handle stress. And these neonicotinoids in particular have been implicated in these types of interactions. Okay, so I'm just going to go through these next few slides quickly, because I'm realizing I'm probably going into more detail than I need to about things that I didn't mean to talk about. So as a postdoc, we wanted to understand where bees were getting their resources in terms of pollen and how contaminated it was. So we placed honeybees in these non-agricultural areas, well, meaning a certain distance away from a cornfield or soybean field, because there's a lot of those in Indiana. And then we placed hives next to a untreated cornfield and a treated cornfield, and we sampled the bee pollen for 16 weeks. We screened that pollen for 67 pesticides, and we chose these 67 based on the common pesticides used in an area, and then we had that pollen identified. So just a picture here of what that pollen looked like. And it turns out bees don't like it when you take their pollen, so I got stung a lot, and also because I have dark hair apparently. So anyway, I'll just focus on this slide in particular because I'm really running out of time here. But in the non-agricultural area, we found 29 different pesticides in the pollen over this 16-week period. And so here I'm showing you the mean concentration in parts per billion. Just a reminder, I had that one example of clothianidin, 2.2 parts per billion is all it takes to kill a bee by contact. So this is a little different because in theory they'd be ingesting the pollen and getting exposed that way. So what I want to emphasize on this slide are two things. One, that you can see every single date here, there is no case where they are only exposed to one pesticide, right? They're often exposed to 6, 7, 8 or more pesticides in the pollen they're collecting on a weekly basis. The other thing I want to emphasize here, so from this purple acetamiprid, all the way down to thiamethoxam. These are neonicotinoids. I certainly expected to see those in high concentrations in the pollen that they brought back to the hive, but that was not the case. Actually, I mean, they were there at low levels, which is still concerning. But the two compounds that we found that were most common were the phenanthrene and perlethrin in dark purple and gray, and you can see it stands out in these bars. And these are actually urban products or urban insecticides that are commonly used for as mosquito repellents or tick or flea treatments. So really surprising. We still aren't really sure what this tells us, and we can't get to the bottom of, where the sources of these might have been, but they were in the pollen consistently. So just to say here that, again, unexpected products that we wouldn't expect, unexpected things in terms of exposure for the bees. So the next two slides, I'm going to show you this is the field that was adjacent to untreated corn. We found 31 pesticides. The pattern is very much the same, so I don't want to go into detail here. I will mention this is not a zero. This is just a case where a skunk got into the hive and destroyed the pollen trap. So anyway, we didn't get pollen on that day, so this is not a zero. But again, 31 pesticides found at in an untreated cornfield, pollen from an untreated cornfield, or I should say pollen collected by bees placed next to an untreated cornfield. And then the same for our neonicotinoid treated cornfield. The hives placed there, the bees collected pollen that had 28 different pesticides. So the trends were very much the same regardless of where those bees were placed. And these sites were 2 or 3 kilometers apart from each other because we tried to control for their ability to move back and forth to where other bees from the other site would be collecting pollen. Okay, so, oh man, I'm almost out of time. Bees are collecting lots of different kinds of pollen in the non-agricultural area. These were the wild or things that pollen from the family Brassicaceae. These are things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, mustard. But I suspect these are actually from wild mustard, which bees really like. We suspect that was the main contributor to this trend, but just showing that they're collecting different things at different times of the season, right? And this is what, well, one of the reasons I imagine life is hard for a bee, right? They've got to find resources that are nutritious and available, but they're changing in time, right, and in abundance. So a lot of work for bees going through these 16 weeks to collect the pollen. We found a different pattern in our 2 cornfields, but the 2 cornfields were similar to each other in that they're collecting pollen from the Fabaceae family, the legumes, clovers, peas, things like that. This is the untreated cornfield, and it was very much the same for the treated cornfield. Okay, so where are risks in the landscape the greatest? And I don't have an answer, right? But it really certainly depends on, hopefully I've given you some context for how we might think about where risks will be the greatest. You know, a natural area, a park, an orchard, the risks are going to vary. And it's not just based on what's being sprayed there, right? It's based on the pollinators that you have there and who you're trying to protect. So how can you promote safe habitat? I'm just going to throw these up really quickly because these are things that many of you probably know. The key thing is please spray only when you need to, right? Most people don't like insects, even in their landscape. And so like you see something and you feel like you need to spray. So try to spray only when you need to. And if you do have to spray, spray when the pollinators are not active. Don't spray when something that a crop, for example, or plants that are nearby are also in bloom, right? Because this will attract bees to the area. So try to take care to spray not only your crop, but be mindful of what's around it. And then be mindful of drift. Don't spray when it's really windy. Don't put on a product if you know it's about to rain. I mean, there's other implications there too, like wasting your time. And look for the bee advisory symbol on products. And this is maybe not for those of you who are spraying like in a commercial setting, but for like, if you are using products in your landscape, look for this logo because this is a new one that they have to help people be aware. You know, if you buy something from Lowe's, it's going to have this logo. So look for that so that you can know the key details about the product and how you can use it properly to minimize risk to bees. And then the last thing I'll mention here is providing high quality habitat, right? And this goes along with not spraying things all the time. But you could put some nice wildflowers that are native to the area, maybe out in your landscape. Um, so, um, you know, you can do different mixes or flowers, and of course, think about whether you'd have to use pesticides on them, whether you'd have to mow them a lot or burn them, although this is more for people who are like managing rangeland or something. Please plant useful flowers, not just ornamental ones. And by useful flowers, I mean flowers that provide, over the course of the season, pollen or nectar, or pollen and nectar in combination, because this really helps the bees. So they can come to a plant that has both, or you know they can come to one spot and collect what they need, nectar and pollen, from the same flower patch. And then particularly for native plants, you know, please try to tolerate those messy stems and plant stands or bunches of plants, right, that are overwintering, because these can actually be key sources of habitat for wild bees. And so I just have a picture here of a little bee hotel. These are pretty popular now. I've got a bunch of them. And these can be great for bees, right? So there's good resources available throughout the season, and habitat where they can live so that you get them to stick around in an area where they're going to be relatively safe. So I think I'm just going to stop there. And even though I have a few slides left, I'll just show you, I'll just put these pictures here. We're putting out some wildflowers in one of our research stations to promote pollinators and see if that changes the pollinator community. But so here's some examples if anyone's interested in wildflowers.